In Big Cypress National Preserve, Florida, I heard the crying before I saw any tracks. It did not sound like a fawn, and it did not sound like an injured Florida panther. It was choked and hidden deep among the flooded bald cypress trees, like a child trying not to call for its mother. I was tracking a Burmese python nearly 17 feet long when the water suddenly began to bubble. Between the roots, a baby Bigfoot covered in reddish-brown hair was being squeezed inside the coils of a dark, shining body. I woke before the sky was fully bright, at that hour when South Florida still holds the last bit of cool air before the sun turns everything into steam. My small wooden house stood not far from Ochapee, between a few cabbage palms and a yard full of old tire marks. My name is Ethan Cole Whitaker. I am 43 years old, a licensed hunter and invasive python catcher, a job that sounds strange to outsiders but feels very real to anyone who has watched the swamp slowly lose its life to a predator that does not belong there. I made black coffee, then stood at the sink and looked into the backyard, where the pale yellow porch light shone on the gearbox beside my pickup. Every morning before I went deep into Big Cypress, I checked the same things: snake hook, rope, thick cloth bags, machete, headlamp, spare batteries, radio, water bottle, first aid kit, sidearm, satellite phone, and my worn waterproof notebook. I believe in checking safety locks twice, tying knots correctly, reading the mud before setting a foot down, and never letting pride walk ahead of good sense. I had promised Olivia, my daughter, that when she came home for Thanksgiving break, I would have my father's old radio fixed so the two of us could listen to baseball the way we did when she was small. Olivia was 19, studying nursing in Tampa, and she had a habit of sending voice messages late at night because she knew I woke earlier than normal people. I played one while putting bandages into my bag. Her voice came through the speaker, a little hoarse with sleep, reminding me to bring extra water, eat something besides jerky, and stop pretending I was still 25. I smiled, but my chest stayed heavy. That morning I did the same as always, though there was a feeling in me I could not name, as if the swamp had woken before I did and was waiting for me to step inside. I had just closed the gearbox when Marlene Ortiz called. Marlene was a ranger in that area, a short woman with sharp eyes who spoke even less than I did, but could read tracks like words on paper. She said there had been a report of a large python near a cypress dome north of Turner River Road, in a section where the trail cameras had recently stopped capturing raccoons, rabbits, and small wading birds. The moment I heard large python, my hand automatically finished locking the box. In South Florida, Burmese pythons are no longer strange news, but every large one missed is a long shadow over the whole area. Marlene went quiet for a few seconds, then added that the camera had also caught a streak of red hair stuck to a tree trunk higher than a person's head, along with several footprints she could not classify as black bear, Florida panther, or human. I let out a dry laugh and asked if tourists had been watching cryptid shows again and walking barefoot through the mud. Marlene did not laugh. Her silence bothered me more than any warning could have. She only said that if I went in, I should keep my eyes sharper than usual, then sent the coordinates to my device. I looked at the red dot on the screen, finished the cold coffee, and told myself one strand of hair did not make a monster. The woods have many ways of making people put the wrong pieces together. I grew up in Georgia, hunting deer with my father since I was a boy, and my father always taught me that the scariest thing in the woods is not what you do not know. It is the moment you think you know everything. I drove the pickup away from the house when the eastern sky had only started turning blue-gray. The small John boat rocked behind the hitch, bumping lightly over every pothole in the dirt road. On both sides, sawgrass stood thick under the mist, while bald cypress trunks rose in the distance like pillars of a church swallowed by water. This place breathes through mud, heat, endless insects, and black water so flat you cannot tell whether the bottom is shallow or whether a mouth is waiting below. When I turned off the main road, the sun had risen above the trees, making steam lift from the wet ditches like thin smoke. An alligator lay close to the canal edge, showing only its eyes and the ridge of its nose. A few white ibises rose into the air, their long legs pulling bright drops of water behind them. I lowered the window a little, and the smell of rotting leaves, warm mud, and wild grass rushed into the cab, familiar enough to almost feel comforting. After the divorce, after Olivia moved to Tampa, after deer season in Georgia no longer made me feel like I belonged anywhere, this swamp gave me something close to purpose. I only followed each slide mark, each nest of eggs, each cold, heavy body, and did my small part. I parked on higher ground, dragged the boat down into the water, locked the truck, then stood still for a minute to listen. That morning, I heard distant frogs, wings brushing the grass tops, and water dripping from cypress roots into the swamp. But under those familiar sounds, there was a strange hollow space, like a crowded room suddenly going quiet when you walk in. I wrote down the coordinates, checked the wind direction, then pushed the boat through the shallow water. In some places I had to get out and pull it, the water rising above my ankles and the mud sucking at my boots so hard every step made a wet breathing sound. On the mud beside a cluster of pond apple trees, I found the first slide mark. It was wider than my wrist and curved across the water's edge, with faint parallel belly scale lines pressed into it. This thing left a trail, like a log that knew how to crawl. I crouched, set my finger beside the mark, and estimated that the body had to be large, maybe over 16 feet if the track was as fresh as I thought. The mud edges had not collapsed yet, and the water inside the groove was still cloudy, meaning it had passed recently. I took out my notebook, wrote the direction, then looked left because something did not fit. A few feet from the slide mark was a small footprint. At first, I thought it was a child's footprint, and that thought made me angry at once, because nobody had a reason to bring a barefoot child into this area. But when I leaned closer, I saw it was wrong. The foot was wider than a child's foot of that length. The heel was deep, the toes spread strangely, the big toe angled outward, and the whole print sank into the mud as if the body above it was far heavier than the foot size suggested. I found a second print, then a third, spaced unevenly. Whatever it was moving unsteadily or in a hurry. I forced myself to breathe slowly. Nearby, a pond cypress trunk had scratch marks at chest height, not 4 clear claw lines, like a bear would leave, but wide, shallow tears, as if a muddy hand had slid down the bark. I took photos, but steam dotted my phone screen and blurred the image. I wiped it with my shirt, took another, then put the phone away faster than I needed to. I followed the python slide through still water, where roots rose like old knuckles. Now and then I saw red hair caught on sawgrass, only a few coarse strands, longer than raccoon fur. I did not pick them up right away. I was afraid that if I held them, the story I was trying to deny would grow heavier in my hand. Near noon, the heat pressed down so hard that sweat ran into my eyes and made everything sting. I stopped under a cypress shadow, drank water, ate a protein bar that had gone soft from the heat, then checked the radio. The signal cracked, but I could still hear Marlene's broken voice asking for an update. I reported a large python trail moving toward the cypress dome and said there might be a lost person or someone leaving strange footprints. Inside my stomach, there was a cold space that did not belong to the weather. Then the crying came. It came from deeper inside the bald cypress, where sunlight was cut into small pieces across the water by the canopy. I had heard fawns separated from their mothers, injured raccoons, bobcats calling at night, and even a distant panther scream during mating season. This sound was none of those. It was choked and low, then rose at the end, as if something squeezed it in the throat. What froze me was not how loud it was, but how hard it tried to hold itself back. An animal usually cries straight out from pain or fear. This sound had short pauses, as if the one making it knew that crying out would bring danger closer. I turned off the radio, dropped to one knee, and listened again. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath. Only water dripped, and that crying echoed from inside the cypress dome. I placed a hand on my gun, then pulled it away almost immediately. I moved slowly toward the sound, placing each step on roots or firmer mud, trying not to send large waves through the water. The python's slide also led that way, clear in the mud at times, lost under dead leaves at others. The small footprints appeared again at the water's edge, deeper than before, with a drag mark beside them, as if a knee or hand had scraped down. I bent and saw a small drop of blood thinning in the water, pale pink spreading out and disappearing. When I lifted my head, my gut tightened. I was no longer thinking about tourists or fishermen. I was no longer laughing to myself about the skunk ape. I only knew something alive was being hunted in the water ahead, and the thing hunting it might be longer than my boat. Before I could move farther, I heard a man behind me. Duke Rollins stepped out of the grass, his hunting shirt open, sweat darkening his baseball cap, a small camera with a microphone in his hand. He had once been a good hunter, once had an eye for tracks that I respected, but in recent years he had slipped into easier money, guiding illegal hunts at the edge of restricted land, selling coordinates to thrill-seeker groups, and filming sensational videos for a few thousand views. Seeing him there, with no permit and no ranger radio, made irritation rise faster than the heat. Duke said he had heard there were signs of a skunk ape baby in this area, and if the two of us filmed a clear clip, we would never have to slog through mud catching pythons for pay again. I told him this was a preserve, not a stage, and that the crying could be an injured animal. Duke shrugged and said injured animals got views too, if the lighting was right. That made me want to grab him by the collar, but I only looked at the small drone sticking out of his backpack and saw another problem taking shape. I lowered my voice and told him to go back to his vehicle before Marlene brought people in and wrote him up. Duke looked over my shoulder toward the cypress dome, and the smile on his face thinned. The crying came again, weaker this time, almost swallowed by the water. Even Duke went quiet. I did not wait for him to agree. I turned and kept following the slide mark, faster this time, but staying low. Clouds crossed the sun, changing the color of the light. The swamp turned blue-gray, and the cypress trunks looked like shadows standing inside an old church. I found another clump of reddish-brown hair caught on a root, this time with a faint streak of blood. I put on gloves, picked it up, and dropped it into a sample bag. The hair was coarse and long, smelling of warm mud and a sharp, musky odor, not like bear, not like wild dog, not like any animal I had ever pulled from a trap. Duke cursed quietly behind me, but still followed. I was about to turn and snap at him again when the water ahead began to bubble. Not the small bubbles of fish. A low wave moved sideways through the roots, heavy and deliberate. I raised one hand to signal stop. We both stood still. Something large had just dived or slid into the water among the bald cypress. I followed the direction of the wave, then looked up toward the higher bank of a hardwood hammock not far away. At first, I thought it was a dark, burned tree trunk. Then that trunk turned its head. It stood between two cypress trunks, taller than any man I had ever met, with wide shoulders, long arms hanging low, and a body covered in dark hair with a copper shine where sunlight touched the edges. It only looked at me, so silent I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I lifted my flashlight, even though it was not fully dark yet, more from stupid reflex than decision. The beam touched its face for a fraction of a second, long enough for me to see amber eye shine and a line of silver-gray hair across one shoulder like an old scar. Then it stepped back into the trees, without making any sound that matched its size. Duke let out a broken breath behind me. I had hunted long enough to know when I was looking at an animal. But that afternoon, in Big Cypress, with the crying growing weaker in the water and the tall shadow vanishing on the bank, I was not sure the thing looking back at me was only an animal. After the tall shadow vanished from the bank, I stood still for a few more seconds, long enough for mosquitoes to gather around the back of my neck and sweat to run down my spine. Duke still could not say a word behind me, and that was stranger than the shape that had disappeared into the cypress, because Duke Rawlins was never quiet when he was scared. I lowered the flashlight, watched the water smooth out again, then forced myself back to the only part of the job I understood. The python's slide was still there, the small footprints were still there, and the crying had stopped, though its echo remained caught in my ears. I knew I should not go deeper as daylight faded, because the swamp at dusk has a way of turning every distance into a mistake. I told Duke I was making camp on the nearby high ground and calling Marlene with the location. I pulled the boat to a firm mud shelf, took out the tarp, anchor lines, and gear bag, then set up a low shelter between 3 old bald cypress trunks. The ground was not fully dry, but it was high enough to keep water from running in if the rain stayed light. I called Marlene on the radio and reported that I had confirmed signs of a large python, had one unauthorized person in the area, and might have an injured young animal near the cypress dome. I did not mention the tall figure on the bank. I did not mention amber eyes. Marlene asked if I needed a support team. I looked at Duke, then at the drone sticking from his backpack, then at the black water where the crying had been. I told her to come in tomorrow morning, and tonight I would hold position. She went quiet for a beat, then reminded me to activate the emergency signal if I heard gunshots or lost contact. After that, I called Olivia. I meant to tell her the day had been so strange I did not know where to put it in my head, but when her voice came through, warm and tired after a hospital training shift, I only asked if she had eaten dinner. I told her the swamp sounded strange today, then stopped before the sentence went too far. She asked if I was okay. I looked into the darkness between the tree trunks and said I was just in a place that did not like people talking too much. After the call, I put the satellite phone inside a waterproof pouch, ate a few pieces of jerky without tasting them, then sat with my back against a tree, the gun within reach, but pointed at nothing. Night lowered itself over Big Cypress, slowly and surely, covering the water with a black shine like oil. Frogs called to each other, insects droned, and somewhere an alligator dragged itself through mud with a heavy rustle. Duke set up a hammock about 20 yards from me, but I knew he was not sleeping. I only sat and listened to the swamp, trying to separate normal sounds from the ones that raised the hair on my neck. I stayed awake until nearly midnight, then finally drifted into a sleep as thin as paper, my hand still close to the machete. When I opened my eyes, the sky was not yet bright, but the blackness had faded at the edge of the canopy. The first thing I saw was that my medical bag was no longer beside my backpack. I shot upright, heart pounding, my hand grabbing the gun before I realized no one was in camp. My medical bag lay about 8 feet from the tarp, dragged through the mud but not torn open. A roll of gauze had rolled beside a tree root, and the antiseptic bottle was still there. I knelt and shone the light down. In the soft mud beside the bag was a small handprint, 5 long fingers, wide palm, very clear because the mud was still wet. It was not a child's hand. It was not a raccoon or possum track either. The fingers had longer joints, blunt tips, short nails, and the gap between the thumb and the other fingers made me swallow hard. The handprint pointed toward the medical bag, as if whatever left it knew something useful was inside. I picked up the gauze and checked what was missing. Nothing had been taken. There was only a dark reddish mud smear on the edge of the bag and a few reddish-brown hairs caught in the zipper. I remembered the crying trapped in the throat, the small, uneven footprints, and an unwanted thought came to me. But when I searched the high patch around camp, the small footprints did not run straight from the cypress dome to the camp. They appeared at the edge of the tarp, then vanished into thick grass, as if the creature had been brought close, or had come by a route I could not see. Duke walked over, his face gray from lack of sleep, and asked if it was a bear. I looked at the handprint, then at him. We both knew the answer was no. I told Duke to stay in camp and not touch anything. Of course, he followed me less than 5 minutes later. I began tracking the small prints through the wet prairie, where the water only reached my ankles, but the mud gripped my boots like hands. Every step made a bubbling sound, and the smell of stirred mud rose thick and sour. The small footprints appeared in sections, sometimes clear on exposed mud, sometimes only pressed grass or cloudy water between sawgrass clumps. I saw low branches broken, a half-eaten pond apple with bite marks unlike deer or bear cub. On a rotting log, a patch of red hair clung beside a faint blood smear. The stride length was too short, as if a small body was hurt or exhausted. Between those tracks, the python's slide appeared clearly at times and disappeared into deep water at others. It was moving the same way. I did not know if the python was hunting the young creature or if the young creature, in panic, had moved into the python's hunting path. Either way, every fresh sign made the distance between them feel shorter in my mind. Duke started breathing hard behind me, but he did not complain. We reached a wider stretch of water where the wet prairie ran into the cypress dome. The water there was black and deep, reflecting the canopy in broken lines. I saw the small footprints stop at the muddy edge, turn sideways, then move back a little, as if the young creature had hesitated before finding another way. Across the water, about 40 yards away, the tall shadow appeared again. This time, I saw it more clearly because daylight filtered through the mist. It stood beside a bald cypress, one hand on the bark, shoulders broad, copper-brown hair darkened by moisture, with gray-silver streaks across the back of its neck. It was looking toward the cypress dome first, not at us. Its chest rose and fell, and its hands gripped the tree trunk so hard, bark peeled away. A very low sound came from its throat, not loud, but it made the water between the banks tremble in small circles. It was a restrained call, the sound of something strong enough to break an elk's bones, yet helpless before a strip of black water. It stepped forward half a step, then stopped. The water was deeper right in front of it, where the large slide mark vanished under dead leaves. I did not know whether it feared water, feared the python, or feared some memory tied to that water. But I saw the tension in its shoulders, and in a painful way, I recognized a mother. Not a mother in the human sense, not some gentle image I created to comfort myself. Just protective instinct, worry, and helplessness. Things that do not need language to be understood. Duke lifted his camera. I heard the small click behind me and spun around, yanking his wrist down. He whispered that this was proof of a lifetime, and I looked back across the bank where the large creature had turned its gaze toward us. I felt the air change. The low hum in its chest deepened, and the birds in the trees went silent. I let go of Duke, but told him through clenched teeth that if he scared her, everything here would die or disappear before he got his chance to change his life. Duke looked at me with anger and fear mixed together, then lowered the camera, though the hunger stayed in his eyes. We followed the water's edge, looking for a way around. The small footprints wandered into a drier hardwood hammock, where dead leaves lay thick and roots rose like veins. There I found low scratches on bark, mud stuck at hip height, and the python's trail cutting through everything like a rope dragged through ash. I marked the spot with a small strip of orange tape, then pulled off my gloves and wiped sweat from my face. A strange stink drifted on the wind, heavier than mud, sharp like wet hair mixed with rotting leaves and a touch of sulfur. I looked around, but did not see the large creature. I only felt that she still knew where we were. Duke could not last long. Early in the afternoon, he pulled out the drone and said he would fly it just high enough to see the cypress dome from above. I told him not to, but he had already turned it on. The small rotors tore the air, and immediately a flock of wading birds burst out of the grass. That sound did not belong in the swamp. It was too clean, too mechanical, and I hated it the second it left Duke's hand. The drone moved over the water, heading toward the place where the mother creature had stood. A few seconds later, from the far side of the dome, a heavy knock hit a tree trunk. then another, closer. Duke stared at the screen, his face lighting with excitement. I lunged to grab the controller, but he twisted away. On the screen, I only had time to see a patch of copper-brown hair rush between the bald cypress trunks, moving so fast the image blurred. The drone wobbled, panicked birds scattered, and somewhere inside the dome, the choked cry sounded once, very short. I turned the controller off by smashing it against a tree. The drone dropped into the distant grass with a soft thud. Duke cursed at me, but I did not care. I only listened to the silence after that cry, and knew we had pushed the frightened thing deeper in. I grabbed Duke by the shirt and told him to go back to camp right now if he still wanted to walk out of here on 2 legs. This time, he did not argue loudly, but his eyes said he had not given up. I spent the rest of the afternoon working alone at the edge of the cypress dome. I found where the python had chosen its ambush spot. It was a deeper pool, wrapped by bald cypress roots, tangled together like a cage. Dead leaves floated on the surface, with broken branches, a few white bird feathers stained with mud, and a faint, familiar, fishy smell. Places like that attract small animals because they are cool and sheltered from the wind, but they also give pythons a perfect place to lie still. I saw a large circular slide around the edge of the dome, not a straight line passing through. The python had circled here many times, smelling, waiting, tightening the area like a living trap. In the mud were signs that the young creature had struggled. 2 small hands had scraped down, 1 knee had sunk deep, then a drag mark disappeared near the roots. I found a piece of python scale with a red hair stuck to it. My hand froze when I picked it up. Everything was clearer than I wanted. The young creature had escaped once, but was not strong. The python was still close, and the mother either could not or would not cross the deep water to pull it out. I marked 3 points, checked the rope, snake hook, and machete, then planned the approach if I had to pull a large python from the roots. None of the options were clean. Darkness came too fast, like someone had pulled a black cloth over the canopy. I knew my rule. Do not handle a large python alone in deep water when the light is gone. That rule had kept me alive. Then I heard a weak clicking sound from inside the dome, so small it was almost just a water drop out of rhythm. I stood there between experience and conscience, and felt both pulling me in opposite directions. I returned to camp for more rope, lights, bandages, and the satellite phone. Duke sat under the tarp, pretending to check camera batteries, but I saw his hands shaking. I told him that if he wanted to help, he could hold the backup light and not step into the water. He nodded too quickly. The second night came down heavier than the first. The air thickened, mosquitoes rose like smoke, and the cypress dome ahead became one dark mass with its own breathing. I tied the rope around my waist, not fully tight yet, just ready. From the opposite bank, the mother creature's low hum sounded, long and deep, making my chest vibrate as if I stood beside a bass speaker. I did not see her, but I knew she was there. I turned on my headlamp, checked the gun, then dimmed the light so my eyes could adjust. Near midnight, the crying returned. This time it no longer tried to hide. It was urgent, choked, breaking and sinking, as if something was squeezing air from that small chest. I rushed out from under the tarp, water splashing around my boots. The light swept over roots, black water, and widening ripples. In the middle of the cypress dome, a small reddish-brown hairy arm clung to a root and shook violently. The fingers scraped bark, slipped, then grabbed again. Below it, the water bulged into a long curve, dark and heavy. I had not yet seen the full python, but I saw one brown-black patterned coil tightening around something under the water. Across the bank, the mother creature released a desperate low sound that seemed to pass straight through my ribs. In that moment, every doubt, every question about proof, every fear that people would call me crazy dropped from my head. I was no longer tracking a python. I was standing before a child being pulled into the water, and if I hesitated any longer, Big Cypress would close its mouth and go silent, as if no cry had ever been heard. I do not remember which thought made me step into the water first, because everything happened too fast and too slowly at the same time. Part of me was still the python catcher who had survived by strict rules, the man who knew not to handle a big snake in deep water with poor light, not to let mud lock his feet, and not to let emotion pull him past a safe distance. But the other part, the part that had heard that crying for 2 nights, only saw a small, reddish-brown, hairy arm clinging to a root and slipping lower, little by little. I wrapped the rope around my waist, tied the knot with fingers slick from sweat, then clipped the other end to the largest bald cypress at the edge of the high ground. I pulled twice to make sure the rope held against the bark, set my headlamp to a wide beam, tucked the snake hook under my arm, and held the machete in my right hand. Duke stood behind the tarp, his face pale in the spare light, but I no longer had time to judge whether his fear was real or only the feeling of a man realizing the video he wanted might come with death. I told him to keep the light low and not step into the water. The black water reached the top of my boots, then my calves, then my knees. Each step had to be placed slowly. I turned the toe of my boot to search for a solid root, then shifted my weight. The crying ahead broke again, then choked into short breaths. I saw the small arm twitch. On the far bank, the mother creature gave a long, low sound that sent rings through the water around my hips. I did not look at her for long, because 1 second of distraction would be enough for a 17-foot python to turn me into the next part of the story. When I was about 10 yards from the roots, the water bulged on my left. A patch of brown-black and dull yellow pattern appeared, then sank, slick and thicker than my thigh. I stopped, breathed deep through my nose, and tried to let professional memory speak over fear. A python does not need to bite and kill right away. It needs me to fall, lose balance, and let one coil slide around my leg or waist. I set the snake hook ahead of me, used the end to test the space between 2 root clusters, and took another step. The light swept over cypress knees, dead leaves stuck to the surface, and finally landed on the young creature. For the first time, I saw its entire upper body clearly, and it made me forget how to breathe. It was probably under 4 feet tall if standing upright, but its arms were unusually long, its shoulders small, its narrow chest jerking with every breath. Wet reddish-brown hair clung to its body, exposing patches of dark skin beneath. One eye was swollen, and its mouth hung open without sound. Both hands clung to the bald cypress root so hard they were bleeding. The long fingers trembled, both wild animal and something far too close to us for me to calmly name. The python's body was wrapped around its belly and thighs. One coil was underwater, another lifted above the surface like a living cable. I had seen many python-wrapped prey animals, from raccoons to fawns, but never once had fear looked back at me through eyes like that. I raised my left hand slowly, showing I was not grabbing at its face. The python squeezed harder. The small body folded down, and the cry turned into a short, choking click. I immediately set the snake hook against the snake's body near the upper coil and pushed down, searching for a gap. The python reacted like a huge muscle suddenly coming alive. Water exploded around me, splashing my face and my light, making the beam jump. I braced my shoulder against a cypress root and strained my arm to push the hook down, but the snake's body was too slick and too powerful. It did not need to think. It only needed to squeeze. The mother creature gave a deep growl from the far bank, like a sound coming out from under the earth. She stepped down to the water's edge, then stopped, both hands open, short nails scraping the mud. I could feel how badly she wanted to charge in. In that moment, I no longer saw her as a monster outside the story. I gritted my teeth and slid the machete between a dead root and the snake coil, not cutting down, only cutting the root to create space. The blade hit rotten wood, bounced, then bit in. I pulled, twisted and pressed my knee into the mud. A section of root snapped, opening just enough room to slide the hook deeper. The python thrashed again, and the coil slipped half an inch. The young creature caught one short, rattling breath and clawed harder at the root. I knew I was doing the right thing, but right did not mean enough. Right then, a sharp white light shone over my shoulder. Duke had stepped to the water's edge, camera raised, backup light pointing straight into the cypress dome. I turned and shouted at Duke to turn it off, but my voice was swallowed by water and the mother's low sound. His drone shot over my head with a thin buzzing like a metal insect. It wobbled between the trees, hit a low branch, then fell into the water near the roots. Its rotors kept spinning under the shallow surface, making a frantic, grinding sound. The python squeezed hard at once. The young creature released a cry so dry it chilled the back of my neck. On the far bank, the mother lunged forward 2 steps, water splashing around her legs, then stopped, her whole body shaking. I understood that if Duke kept going, she would either attack him or charge into the dome, and both would end badly. I could not let go of the hook, so I only turned my head and yelled that he was killing it. Maybe that sentence reached Duke, because the light lowered, then went dark. Darkness returned, but the trapped drone still made the water tremble. I breathed in, breathed out, and searched for the python's head. In muddy water, a big snake does not always appear the way people imagine. I saw it to my right, less than 3 feet from my shoulder, its blunt triangular head rising between dead leaves, its eyes black as oil seeds. I knew I could not free the young one while the head was loose. I also knew that firing a gun in water, among roots, and a small creature trapped in coils was something I had always wanted to avoid. But the coil tightened again. The small arm on the root weakened. The fingers slid down, leaving thin lines of blood. I drew my gun with my left hand, clumsy because my hand was wet, and the rope pulled me off balance. I waited for the python's head to move away from the young creature's body. I waited for it to lift 1 more inch above the water. I waited for the angle to point down into mud instead of across the roots. That 1 second stretched so long I could hear my own breathing. Then I pulled the trigger. The gunshot inside the cypress dome did not echo the way it would on open ground. Water, trees, and mud swallowed it, turning it into a heavy punch inside my chest. Nightbirds exploded from the canopy. Duke cursed behind me. The mother creature went silent. The water in front of me burst apart. The python thrashed violently, its body smashing against roots, against my hip, against the rope around my waist. I did not wait to see whether it was dead. I put the gun away, shifted the hook to my right hand, and threw myself toward the coil as it loosened for 1 beat. Both hands gripped the cold, slick muscle and pulled. The python still had power, still twitched, but the rhythm of its squeeze had broken. I wedged my knee against a root, slid one hand under the coil, and used the other to push the young creature's belly upward. It clawed my arm, short nails cutting through skin with razor pain. I did not blame it. I pulled one coil, then another. The mud under my boots collapsed. The water rose to my waist. I felt the rope around me tighten and heard bark groan behind me. Duke finally did something useful. He ran to the tree holding the rope and pulled backward, keeping me from being sucked into the middle of the dome. I growled at him to hold tight, then used the machete to cut a root caught around the coil. The blade slid against the slick scales, and I quickly changed angle, afraid of hitting the young creature. One more pull, and the final coil slipped off its belly. The small body collapsed, half floating, half sinking, lighter than I expected, but heavy with water and mud. I slid my arms under its armpits, felt its ribs shaking beneath the wet hair, and pulled toward shore. It coughed, spat water, then made broken clicking sounds in its throat. Behind me the python thrashed one last time, spraying water against my neck. I did not turn back. I only looked at the high ground and pulled. When we reached the bank, I almost fell on top of the young creature. Duke grabbed the rope behind me and dragged both of us up from the water. I rolled to the side, gasping, my hands shaking so badly I could not untie the rope right away. The young creature lay in the mud, curled up, both arms around its belly, as if trying to hold itself to the world. Its hair was full of dead leaves, one swollen eye only half open, its breathing rough but steady. I crawled to the medical bag and took out gauze, a clean towel, and water. But the moment I touched near its neck, it startled and clawed wildly, weak but terrified. I stopped and raised my hand before its face so it could see every movement. My language meant nothing to it. I only breathed slowly, lowered my shoulders, and wiped mud from around its nose and mouth with the corner of a towel. It coughed again, water spilling out, then drew a deeper breath. On the opposite bank, the mother creature stepped closer. Each step made the mud sink into deep holes. Duke backed away, tripped over a root, and dropped to the ground, but I did not take my eyes off her. She was almost 3 feet taller than me, shoulders wide as a door, wet copper-brown hair clinging to her chest, amber eyes locked on the young creature. I had a gun on my hip, but I did not touch it. I knew that if she wanted to kill me, she did not need me to give her a reason. She stopped several yards away, chest rising and falling, one giant hand opening and closing. I saw the fight inside that movement. She wanted to take her child back. She feared my hands on its body. She had also watched me pull it from the water. I set the roll of bandage down in the mud and backed away a little. The young creature tried to turn toward its mother, but did not have the strength. It made 2 weak clicks. The low sound from the mother's chest answered, deep and vibrating, nothing like a human lullaby, but softer in rhythm than anything I had heard from her before. I realized I was standing inside a conversation that did not belong to me. So I did the only thing I could. I took my jacket from my pack, spread it on the high ground, then, with the slowest movements of my life, lifted the young creature onto it. It felt frighteningly light in my arms, as if almost all the life had been squeezed out of it. I checked the crushed belly area and saw patches of missing hair and dark bruising under the skin, but no deep tears. Its arms and shoulders had many scratches from the roots, bleeding lightly, but packed with mud. I cleaned them bit by bit with water, not using strong medicine, only wiping and pressing gauze where the bleeding needed to stop. The mother stood completely still, but each time the young one moaned, her hand clenched into the mud. Rain began after that. First only a few large drops hitting cypress leaves, then a thin sheet that filled the water with small circles. I lowered the tarp, tying 2 corners to roots and the other 2 to wooden stakes, enough to protect the young creature from the cold rain. I kept my distance, only sometimes offering a few drops of clean water to its mouth with a wet cloth. It licked lightly, cautious, then turned away. Each time its breathing evened out, something in my chest loosened. Duke finally spoke, his voice smaller than usual, saying we had just filmed something nobody had ever captured. I looked at him, then at the camera lying sideways in the mud, then at the young creature on my jacket, its small chest rising and falling under wet hair. I told Duke it was a child. He made a face, as if trying to hold on to the old world where everything was named by money or views, then said it was not human. I did not get angry at that. I only felt tired. I said, I didn't say it was human. I said it was a child. After that, Duke lowered his head. I saw his shoulders sink, not exactly from guilt, but because something certain inside him had just cracked. The night stretched on like it had no bottom. The mother did not leave. She crouched under a large cypress a few yards from the tarp, her eyes bright and dark by turns in the rain. Sometimes she made a low sound, and the young creature answered with a weak click. I did not know if it was comfort, checking, or some kind of rhythm to keep the child awake. I only knew that whenever the sounds moved back and forth, the forest around us seemed to quiet down. I sat with my back against a tree, the gun's safety off, but the gun farther from my hand than before, my wet shirt sticking to my back, my stomach hurting where the rope had cut into me. Near dawn, the rain stopped. Mist rose from the swamp, making every tree look like it stood behind clouded glass. The young creature moved first. It curled its fingers, touched the edge of my jacket, then made a clearer click than before. The mother stood up. Duke and I both held our breath. She came forward very slowly, not looking at Duke, only at me and the child. I stepped out from under the tarp, both hands open, palms down, trying not to look like a challenge. She bent down. She slid both large hands under the young creature's body and lifted it with a care that did not match her size. The child moaned softly, then pressed its face against its mother's chest. The deep sound from her body moved through the air and through the mud under my boots. I felt like I was witnessing something the forest had never meant for humans to see. She turned away for a few steps, then stopped. I thought she would look back or give a warning. Instead, she set the child down by her feet for 1 second, reached into the wet hair at her side, and lightly tossed a small object toward me. It landed in the mud near my boot, pale white in the first light. I did not pick it up immediately. The mother lifted the child again, looked at me through the mist, then stepped back into the bald cypress. Her shadow grew larger, then smaller, then dissolved into the blue-gray forest. I stood still until the last low hum disappeared. When I finally bent down, I saw that the thing she had left was a smooth, white bone shard tied with dry grass and a few red hairs. I did not know whether it was thanks, warning, or simply something the forest returned to mark a boundary. I held it in my muddy palm while Duke stood behind me without saying a word. Then the sun began slipping through the cypress canopy, shining on the water where the python had nearly squeezed a small life to death. And I understood that the hardest part might not have been pulling it free from that shining dark coil. The hardest part might be walking out of Big Cypress with this memory and deciding what to do with a truth no one should hunt. The morning after the mother creature disappeared with her child, I sat for a long time at the edge of the cypress dome, still holding the white bone shard tied with dry grass and red hair. Sunlight pierced the mist and fell in pale streaks across the water that had just gone calm again. In my mind, that morning did not feel like dawn. It felt like the rest of a night that still refused to fully end. If someone had only looked at me then, they would have seen a soaked man with a torn arm, lips blue from cold and exhaustion, sitting beside a mess of roots, like someone who had just survived a python-catching accident. Part of that was true. The python still lay tangled in the roots farther away, its body half sunk and half floating, brown-black pattern blending into the dead leaves so well that I had to look closely to separate it from the mud. But what I had witnessed could not be written into any report form. I untied the rope from my waist and felt the raw burn where it had cut into my skin like a ring of fire. Duke sat a few steps away, holding his camera, his face grayer than the mist. He no longer looked like a man excited to have life-changing proof. I rinsed the scratches on my arm with clean water, wrapped the gauze tight, then gathered whatever gear could still be used. Each action made me a little clearer, and every bit of clarity brought a harder question. What were we supposed to do with this memory, with the video in Duke's camera, with the bone shard growing heavier in my palm? I heard the motorboat before I saw Marlene. The sound moved through the shallow water, steady and low, completely different from Duke's sharp drone. I stood, slipped the bone into the inner pocket of my jacket, like hiding something hot, and stepped out from under the tarp. Marlene Ortiz appeared between the cypress trees with 2 young staff members. She saw the rope tied around the tree, the slightly bent snake hook, the diluted blood on the mud, the python's thrashing marks, and finally, my arm. She did not immediately ask what anyone else would have asked. She only walked closer to the roots, looked at the dead python, then turned back to me. I reported that a large python had been handled, that there had been an unauthorized person in the area, and that access to the dome should be limited because of deep water, complex roots, and the risk of more large pythons. My voice was hoarse, but I kept it flat enough to sound like a field report. Marlene looked over my shoulder toward the forest where the mother creature had disappeared. Behind the tarp, in the mud, one large footprint still had not been fully washed away by the rain, deep and wide, with water standing in the heel. I instinctively took half a step to cover it. Marlene saw the movement. She did not speak in front of the staff. She only told them to measure the python, photograph the scene, and check the southern area for signs of a lost person. When they had moved far enough away, she lowered her voice and asked if there was something here that needed to be left alone. That question made me more tired than any wound. I wanted to tell everything, to push the weight onto someone with a badge, a map, and the authority to close the whole area. But in my head, I also saw trucks lining the road, people with cameras, guns, floodlights, dogs, people like Duke but more numerous, louder, hungrier. I said that an animal family had been attacked by the python and should not be disturbed. Marlene watched me long enough to know that answer was missing half the truth, then nodded. She said what scared her most was people finding a secret and deciding that discovery gave them ownership of it. She said Big Cypress had already suffered enough pressure from changing water flow, invasive pythons, reckless visitors, and people who wanted to turn every shadow into content. I listened with my throat tight because she had said exactly what I had not dared name. I did not know how much Duke heard under the tarp, but when I turned back, he was opening his camera. I walked over. On the small screen, the shaky video appeared in pieces, light swinging over water, the python coil, the small arm clinging to roots, then a large patch of copper-brown hair on the far bank. The image was not as clear as he had dreamed, but clear enough for anyone watching to know something was not normal. Duke held the camera close to his chest like it was his life. He said this was the only valuable thing he had ever had. I saw sweat and tears on his face, and for 1 second I remembered the Duke from years before, the man who once shared half his water with me on a failed hunt, who laughed loudly around a campfire and had not yet been hollowed out by debt. I did not hate him in that moment. Duke's desperation did not make what he wanted to do right, but it helped me understand why he held the camera like a drowning man holding a branch. I told him that if that video got out, people would not only come find us for interviews, they would find the cypress dome, the footprints, the injured child, the mother, and they would not leave until the forest either bled or swallowed someone to defend itself. Duke looked down at the screen, his finger hovering over replay. From the forest, 3 deep knocks sounded. They were not woodpeckers and not breaking branches. Each knock was spaced just long enough for the listener to understand it was a signal. Marlene lifted her head too. I looked toward a cypress trunk near camp and saw fresh mud smeared at my chest height, shaped as if a large hand had pressed there and dragged downward. The mother had not gone far. She was somewhere behind the curtain of sawgrass and light mist, close enough to know what we were doing with her memory. Duke went pale, but the hunger in his eyes did not fully go out. He stuffed the camera into his bag, said he needed to go back to his vehicle for extra batteries, then started backing away from the tarp. I called his name, but just as one of Marlene's staff asked me to sign the python record, Duke turned and moved quickly into the grass. I realized too late. His backpack held the main memory card. If he reached a road with service, he could send the video before anyone stopped him. I did not ask Marlene for permission. I only told her to watch the camp, then chased Duke's boot tracks through the wet prairie. My injured arm throbbed with every step. Mud splashed my face, and sawgrass cut my pant legs and the backs of my hands. I heard Duke ahead, heavy breathing, grass breaking, and the occasional curse when he slipped. The swamp in daylight is not safer. It only gives people false confidence because they can see light. Duke's boot prints dug deep into the mud. Beside them, after a few hundred yards, I saw other prints. They were far larger than mine, wide and deep, moving parallel to his path. My neck went cold even in the thick heat. The mother creature could have taken Duke at any moment. She only needed to step out from the cypress, swing one arm, and the story of the video would end in a splash. But she did not. She watched. She was waiting to see how I handled the problem of my own kind. That thought frightened me and shamed me at the same time. I caught up with Duke near an old alligator hole, where the mud looked flat but hid deep water beneath dead leaves. He turned back, eyes red, one hand clutching the camera bag. He was about to say something when his heels slid off the firm edge. His body dropped as if the earth had pulled him down. Black water splashed up to his chest and mud locked around his waist. He panicked, flailing, sinking more with every movement. I threw the rope end toward him. He missed the first time. The second time he caught it, but almost pulled me down with him. I wrapped the rope around a root, braced myself, and pulled with all the strength I had left. The smell of trapped mud rose thick and foul. Not far beneath the surface, two alligator eyes appeared, pale yellow and motionless. I told Duke to stop thrashing and kick slowly. He obeyed and finally crawled onto the mud edge, lying face down and breathing like he had just climbed out of a grave. The camera bag fell beside him, mud covering almost the whole zipper. I grabbed it before he could reach for it. Duke lifted his head to fight me for it, then his eyes looked over my shoulder, and every bit of color left his face. I turned slowly. Between two bald cypress trunks, the mother creature stood there. She did not growl, she did not bare her teeth. She only stood still, huge, wet hair hanging in patches, amber eyes watching us as if we were two stupid children playing with knives beside a crib. That silence was more frightening than any roar. Duke began to cry, very softly, almost ashamed of himself. I placed the camera bag on the ground between us and unzipped it. I took out the camera and handed it to Duke, not because I trusted him, but because I wanted him to see his own choice. He watched a few seconds, up to the part where the young creature was pulled from the water, then muted it. I told him that if he wanted people to believe him for the rest of his life, he could start by becoming the kind of man worthy of a truth. Duke looked at me, then at the mother creature standing in the mist. He asked, if nobody saw, who would believe us? I answered that maybe the problem was we kept thinking being believed mattered more than doing what was right. That sentence stayed between us longer than I expected. Duke lowered his head. His fingers shook as he opened the menu. He deleted the main file, then opened the temp folder, deleted the cache, and deleted the earlier clip of the drone falling. I took out the memory card and snapped it in half. The small crack of plastic sounded like a dry twig. I threw one half into the mud near the alligator hole and put the other half in my jacket pocket. Duke closed his eyes, as if he had just watched the last thing he could sell get buried alive. The mother creature still did not leave. After a few seconds, she turned her head toward the cypress dome, then vanished into the trees. I understood that this was not forgiveness. It was only more time. When we returned to camp, Marlene did not immediately ask why Duke was covered in mud or why his camera bag had no card. She only looked at me, then at my arm, as if checking whether I was still awake enough to carry my own responsibility. I told her the dome area should be temporarily closed for safety, at least until the water dropped and the python signs were fully checked. Marlene nodded and signaled the two staff members to collect the equipment and avoid the northern side. Duke sat on the ground under the tarp, hands holding his head, no longer talking about proof. I stood for a while beside the cypress dome, feeling the bone shard in my pocket pressing against my chest like a question. After what had just happened, keeping it began to feel more like stealing than receiving. I took it out. It had dried more, pale white, its surface smooth, tied with dry grass and a few red hairs. I did not know what the mother had meant when she tossed it to me, but I knew that if I kept it, someday on a weak night, I might pull it out as proof for Olivia, for Marlene, or for myself. And if that happened, I would only be different from Duke by a higher price. I walked alone to the edge of the dome and placed the bone on a dry root where the mother had stood looking at me. I spoke softly, though I knew my words might mean nothing to her. I said I did not know what she thought I was, but I would not lead them here. A soft wind moved the sawgrass. The black water stayed still. For a long time, nothing answered except mosquitoes and the rubbing of leaves. Then between two trees on the far side, the young creature appeared. It stood unsteadily, one hand gripping a cypress trunk, its small reddish-brown body still ragged from water and mud. The swollen eye had opened a little. Behind it, the mother bent low, one large hand close to its back, but not touching, as if wanting to let it stand on its own. My heart tightened so sharply it hurt. I did not step forward. I did not call out. I only stood still, both hands loose at my sides. The young creature tilted its head and made a small click, short and dry, then backed into its mother's shadow. The mother looked at the bone on the root. She stepped forward, picked it up with two large fingers, and raised it near her chest. For a moment, I thought everything had ended there. But deeper in the forest, another body appeared through the mist. It was taller than the mother, almost touching the low branches, with thick gray-brown hair around its shoulders, and a long scar running from its neck down its chest. It stood far away, but its presence changed the weight of the air. This was not someone coming to thank us. This was the boundary taking shape. The old male looked at me, then toward the camp where humans were packing up. I felt very clearly that we were being allowed to leave, not welcomed. The mother held the bone close, turned away, and led the young one among the bald cypress trunks. Before disappearing, she placed one hand against a tree and struck it once, softly. The deep sound traveled over the water, entered my chest, then faded into the swamp. I stood there until the forest was only forest again, until every strange sign of life had been hidden by mist and leaves. When I went back to camp, Duke looked at me as if he wanted to ask if they had really just left. I did not answer. I picked up my gear bag, checked that I had left nothing behind, then took one final look toward the cypress dome. That was when I understood that a secret is not something you bury and forget. It is something you live with every day through small choices no one applauds. I once thought saving the child from the python's coils was the hardest part. But as I walked out of Big Cypress that morning, with my arm aching, a broken memory card in my pocket, and a section of forest closing behind me like a door, I knew the harder part had only begun. It was staying silent in a world that rewards the person who shouts the loudest, and keeping respect for something that had looked straight at me and chosen to let me live. I left Big Cypress when the sun was already high, but inside, it still felt like I was walking under the gray light of that dawn. The pickup trembled lightly on the dirt road, dry mud clinging in chunks beneath it, and my arm hurt with every turn of the tires. Marlene drove ahead of me for a while, slowly, as if giving me time to gather myself before stepping out of the forest that had just closed its door behind me. Duke sat in the passenger seat, silent since we had left camp. He did not apologize, and he did not try to explain himself. Sometimes I saw him looking down at his hands, now crusted with dried mud, as if he could still feel the alligator hole pulling him under. I said nothing to him. Sometimes silence is not punishment. Sometimes it is the last space kind enough for a man to look at himself. When we reached the ranger station, Marlene led me into a small room with a slow ceiling fan and the smell of damp paper. I filled out the official report in the clean language the system could tolerate. A large Burmese python was found near a cypress dome and handled under dangerous conditions. One unauthorized person entered the area and was warned. Terrain included complex roots and deep water with possible additional python activity. Temporary access restriction recommended. I wrote slowly because every word I put down covered part of that night. There was no line about a small arm clinging to a root, no line about a low hum shaking the water, no line about amber eyes looking at me as if weighing all of humankind. When I signed my name, the pen tip shook slightly. Marlene took the paper, read it once, then looked at me over the edge of her glasses. She did not ask why the report sounded too neat for the wounds on my arm. She did not ask why Duke looked like a man who had just walked out of a nightmare. She only signed the confirmation, closed the file, and said, "Some places in the woods are better when they do not have names on maps." I nodded. That did not make the weight disappear, but it told me I was not the only one who understood that truth sometimes needs a roof over it, not a stage. I drove home alone in the late afternoon. Duke had caught a ride back toward Naples with a conservation worker, and before getting into the vehicle, he only looked at me once. No handshake, no big promise, only a small, tired nod, enough to make me believe he had at least understood that he had almost sold something that belonged to no one. When I reached the wooden house, I set my gear on the porch, pulled off the mud-caked boots, and sat on the step long enough for mosquitoes to start whining around my ears. The backyard was the same as always, cabbage palms leaning in the hot wind, plastic trash can rattling, my father's old radio lying on the workbench by the window. That normal life hurt more than I expected. I had brought my body home, but part of my mind still stood in the cypress dome, watching the mother lift her child from my jacket. That night, I called Olivia. I meant to keep my voice normal, but my daughter heard it at once. She asked if my arm was okay, because Marlene had messaged her that I had been scratched while handling a python. I looked at the white bandage around my forearm, where the thin but deep cuts crossed my skin, and told her I was fine. I told her I had saved a young one from a big python, but I did not say what the young one was. I described black water, roots, weak breathing, and the feeling of pulling one life out of something squeezing it tight. Olivia stayed quiet longer than usual. Then she said I always pretended I only knew how to hunt, but she thought I was better at saving. That sentence moved through me slowly, like a stone sinking into deep water. I had lived for years by seeing myself as a man who removed dangers from the wild. Invasive pythons, abandoned traps, animals too badly injured to live. Sometimes, even memories no one wanted to mention. But my daughter, from a dorm room in Tampa, saw through the hard shell I had worn so long I thought it was my real skin. After the call, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the refrigerator run and the rain tapping on the tin roof. I took the remaining broken half of the memory card from my pocket. It was small, black, with dried mud along the snapped edge. I had thought I was keeping it as a reminder not to forget, but the longer I looked at it, the more I understood that every piece of proof has a life of its own. Today, it sat in my old ammo box. A year from now, Olivia might find it. 10 years from now, I might grow weak in a bar and pull it out in front of someone to prove I was not lying. Truth, once turned into evidence, begins calling people toward it. I placed the half card in a tin can, lit it with a match, and watched the plastic curl, blacken, and give off a bitter smell. The small flame died quickly, leaving a warped piece no machine could read. I emptied the ash into the trash, washed my hands twice, then returned to the workbench to repair my father's radio. Tiny screws sat in an aluminum tray, copper wires showed under cracked casing, and the volume knob was stuck with dust. I took it apart, cleaned it, and tightened each part, and that work brought me back down to earth better than any prayer. Near midnight, the radio caught a faraway baseball game, the commentator's voice mixed with static, clear one moment and lost the next. I carried it to the porch, set it beside a glass of water, and listened to insects blend with the sound of the crowd over the airwaves. My father once said, "Every man needs a place to put the things he cannot tell." I used to think that place was the woods. Now I am not sure. Maybe that place is the silence after you choose not to tell. The next morning, a message from Duke appeared on my phone. I sat in the truck outside the fast food place in Everglades City, coffee still hot in my hand, reading the short words over and over. He wrote that he still wanted people to believe him, but he did not want them to find it. I looked at the message until the screen went dark by itself. It was not a perfect apology. Duke did not become a good man after one night in the swamp. I did not need him to become a good man. I only needed him to keep one choice. At the exact moment, that choice could protect something that could not write its own request for protection. I deleted the message after reading it, not because I hated Duke, but because I had learned that the fewer traces left behind, the better chance a secret has to live longer. In the following days, life returned in its strange way. I changed bandages, sent a supplemental python report, avoided mentioning the cypress dome when talking to other python catchers, and listened to Olivia tell me about anatomy class over the phone. But every time I walked past the sink, I saw those two small red-haired hands gripping the roots. Every time the wind carried the smell of mud from the canal behind the house, I remembered the mother's low hum. I was not haunted like people in movies who wake up screaming. I only felt that my old world now had a locked room inside it, and I knew something lived there. 3 weeks later, Marlene called and said there were signs of a new python on the western edge, fairly far from the old cypress dome. I took the job, partly because I needed the money, and partly because I did not want fear to turn me into someone who only stood outside the woods. I drove into Big Cypress on a bright morning, after several sunny days had lowered the water. The trail was drier. The mud cracked on higher ground, but the smell of rotting leaves and standing water still hung in the air. I checked traps, recorded a few small slide marks, then stopped at the edge of an old path leading toward the cypress dome. I did not go in. I had promised, even though no one but the forest had witnessed it. On the way back, I saw 3 small footprints in the dry mud near the edge of the path. They were not as clear as the first ones, because the ground had hardened and fallen leaves covered part of them. But the wide heel, spread toes, and short, uneven steps were enough for me to recognize them. Beside them lay a half-eaten pond apple, the pale yellow flesh still wet. I knelt, but touched nothing. From deep among the cypress came a small click, very short, almost like a dry branch cracking in the sun. I lifted my head. There was no large shadow on the bank, no amber eyes, no beautiful reunion scene to put into a story. There was only the swamp, sawgrass, water vapor, and a silence that knew how to watch. I took off my hat and stood still for a while. Inside me was a small, sad joy, the kind of feeling that needs no confirmation. The young one was alive, or at least I was allowed to believe it. I turned away before curiosity could turn me into a man who broke his promise. On the drive home, I thought about everything I used to believe. I used to believe the woods were a place humans entered to take what they needed: meat, money, proof, silence, the feeling that they were still strong. I used to believe hunting meant understanding, and understanding meant the right to name something. Big Cypress taught me differently. Sometimes the forest places a life in your hands and waits to see what you will do when there is no audience, no reward, and no one there to call you a hero. I do not know what that creature is. I do not know whether it belongs to folklore, to some branch of nature we have not touched yet, or only to the darkness humans keep trying to shine lights into. I also do not know who would believe me if I told everything. But I know that under the bald cypress roots that night, a child took another breath because I stepped into the water. And maybe, in a hunter's life, the greatest discovery is not finding something no one has proved before. Maybe it is learning that some things only truly live when you are brave enough to stop hunting them. Hello everyone, I'm Victor, the storyteller of Bigfoot Sasquatch Story. As Ethan's story comes to an end, what stays with me is not the size of the python, and not even the moment he saw the mother creature standing in the mist of Big Cypress. What haunts me most is the choice one man made in just a few seconds, when he could have stepped back to stay safe, but instead walked into the black water because he heard a desperate life crying. Ethan is a hunter, and in many people's eyes, a hunter is someone who enters the woods to track, control, or end a threat. But that night, he did not use his experience only to hunt. He used it to save. That is what gives this story its weight. Sometimes courage is not about facing the scariest thing in front of you. Sometimes it is about recognizing the fear in another living being and still choosing to help. The lesson I want to leave with you after this story is simple, but not easy to practice. When we step into nature, we are not the absolute owners of that place. We are only guests. There are tracks we do not need to follow to the very end. There are secrets we do not need to turn into proof. And there are moments when the right thing is not to film, show the world, or prove that we saw what no one would believe. Sometimes the right thing is to step back, stay silent, and let life keep living. If Bigfoot exists in remote, wild places, maybe the most important question is not whether we can find it. The more important question is this: if we do find it, are we kind enough not to destroy its world? And even if you see this story as folklore-inspired storytelling, the message still matters. Respect nature. Be careful with the greed to prove things. Remember that silence can also be an act of protection. If today's story made you think, leave a comment below. What would you do if you were Ethan? Would you keep the secret or bring the evidence into the light? Don't forget to hit like, subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Story, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Dogman, and the mysteries hidden deep in the forests of North America. If you have a strange experience, a family story, or a memory you cannot explain, send it to us. I'm Victor. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.